All right, everybody, welcome back to the Aptitude Outdoors podcast. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, I'm going to talk about a method of fishing that I learned recently using a big heavy rod and mono filament.
This is the Aptitude Outdoors podcast, where we interview conservationists, hunters, anglers, and outdoorsmen and women to bring you the greatest stories, information, and advice from the best in the world.
So I learned this technique while at the Hunt Fish Podcast Summit. I was talking to the Ranch Fair on my podcast, which if you haven't listened to that episode already, go back. Lots of crazy cool info in there about hunting and fishing. This technique I specifically wanted to try because I'd never heard of it before. And if you've been fishing for a long time, this is probably nothing new to you. I was told by my friend Chester Moore that it is popularized by Rick Clunn, also professional tournament bass fisher. So there's a lot of people who have done this, but I just learned about it and I had to try it for myself. So when I got home, I went online, talked to a few friends, and let's see if I can't smack this on everything in the room. Yep. Got this TFO tactical glass bass rod, 7'4", medium heavy. One of the stiffest rods I've ever had. Definitely the stiffest rod that I own. And I have it paired up with a Quantum 7-to-1 gear ratio bait caster. And if you can hear that little guy, this is what I was throwing on the day I went and tested it out. It is a jerk bait that looks like a yellow perch, kind of. It's pretty cool. Big giant baits, big giant rods, big giant bait casters. And the theory behind this is you're going out, you're throwing this big rod with, I got 12-pound mono on here, and the mono part is part of the process of this, and you're throwing big crankbaits essentially. And when you think about it, when you fish, generally, since I've grown up, it's always been light sensitive rods, graphite rods. Can feel every little tick, every little nip, every little anything on it. You set the hook, get the bass on there. The theory behind this is the rod is super heavy, not sensitive in the least bit, which I can attest to. And the mono stretches, specifically mono, and you're reeling in this big crankbait, you're smacking it against grass or rocks or whatever, going through the water, you piss off a bass, comes up and nails it. So you're still cranking on this thing. You have no idea that this fish has hit it until you feel the fish on, which is the opposite of the way I've always fished. So it's kind of weird to get used to. But the thought process goes, you don't have time to think about it or react. The fish has already hooked itself. And as it takes that bait and tries to swim away, it's already hooked. You're on. The fish is hooked well. And so I went out and tested this. I spent a few hours fishing. It was so windy. I couldn't stay put. Even with an anchor in my kayak, I could not stay in place. It was just pretty much impossible. So it was really hard to try and go out in this lake. And the lake I'm fishing has a really long, flat sandbar that goes out hundreds of feet. And then it just kind of drops off. So it's actually a pretty good place to catch bass. It goes into basically 7 foot of water to 30 foot of water in a few feet. And from everything I've read, bass like those steep drop-offs into their little sanctuary areas, whatever. So perfect place to test this. I was out there for a few hours, didn't really have anything. I did catch a very aggressive large bluegill on a big crankbait, which was hilarious to me. I'm like, what was this bluegill thinking? Like, what was it going to do? The bait was a third as big as the fish. Love those little guys. They just have the fight in them, and it's so cool. So anyway, go out and test this out. I'm not very proficient with bait casters. The only rod that I could find was one with a setup for bait casters only. I prefer spinning just because I'm comfortable with it, which is good. This pushed me out of my comfort zone in a lot of different ways. And I really, had to work through the so annoying backlash issues. But I think I finally somewhat got it figured out. So there's that. That's a me thing I need to work on. But Really like this TFO rod. I've been actually getting most of my rods from them lately because they're nice rods, and I like them. I have a fly rod from them, whatever. Enough of that. But it's so different from what I used to. So I need to test this out. I go out, I fish. I'm just getting nothing. And then I'm getting ready to go in. And as usual, you say last cast about 30 times. And I'm going back in. There's a big weed line on that point I was talking about, that big sandbar. So right where it drops off, the weeds basically come flush with where the drop off is. So I paddle back. I'm on the other side of the weeds where it goes into the really shallow sandy stuff. And they kind of have a pretty defined edge there. And then it kind of goes down into smaller weeds that are close to the bottom, and they're a lot more spread out. So I fish that edge, and I'm sitting there in my kayak. I get the signal from my wife. She's standing on the dock, and she says, it's time to start wrapping things up. So I'm like, oh man, I didn't catch anything except for one bluegill. I'm kind of bummed. So I launched this jerk bait out, the one that's still on this rod, and cranking. I've been getting caught up on weeds all day just because I'm getting blown around. It's hard to remember where the weed edge was if I move 5 feet in either direction. And I'm like, dang it, this sucks. So I go to pull it, and I'm pulling the rod up to try and get it off the weeds, and the line is moving the other way. And I'm like, oh shit, there's a fish on this thing. So I'm hauling, and it didn't like bend the rod over like I'm used to on some of these cheaper rods or these graphite rods that are super sensitive. You can feel every little twitch of the fish as it's pulling, and you feel that tension. I didn't really feel that on this rod. It just felt like I was horsing in this fish, and I'm thinking it's a massive bass because there's some weight to it. I'm just like cranking in on this thing, and there's always that huge moment of excitement, especially on a day like that where you don't catch shit and you're just waiting to see what's on the other end of that line. Like, how big is this fish? It feels awesome. Pull up, and next to my kayak, there is a northern pike. And I am like, oh boy, this is not what I expected. Luckily, I spent countless hours watching ice fishing videos in the winter, even though I didn't get to ice fish because we didn't get any freaking ice. And so I grab him, under his jaw like you should, so they don't tear your fingers open. Pull him up. He had the super insanely sharp hooks of this jerk bait in the top of his mouth. This is the hardest hook I've ever had to take out of a fish. I had a little pair of pliers, and I worked to get them out. So I'm holding this giant pike. I'm freaking out. It's decent size. I mean, I'm not catching pike left and right. I didn't target them, but they're big fish and they fight like hell. And it opened my eyes to how effective this method can be, because I didn't know the fish was on. If I would have tried to set that hook or something, I may have missed him. I've missed thousands of bass probably doing that method of just waiting to feel something and setting the hook. So the fish was on. He was hooked incredibly well, and he fought me all the way to the boat on this big heavy rod, which made it easier to reel him in because this thing is just stiff. I've never fished a rod this stiff. So it works. It does work, and I can attest to that it works. Is this what I'm going to use in every single scenario for bass fishing? Absolutely not. It's definitely fun. It's definitely new. And I would say if you're targeting larger bass that you don't want to miss, this might be a good way to go. If you're just going around and screwing around, I don't think it matters. And there's opposing views on this. If you watch Tactical Bassin at all on YouTube, I watch those guys quite a bit too. They have underwater footage that show bass just engulfing any sort of bait. And I think the last video I watched while I was researching this, it's like 0.3 seconds that it takes a bass to put a bait in its mouth and spit it back out. So they're saying, the common reason that someone would use a setup like this is people say when bass open their mouths, that initial tick you feel is the water pushing the pressure of the water, or whatever, I don't know the technical term of it, pushing out hitting your lure before the bass actually sucks the lure in. And that's why if you've ever watched Bill Dance or anything, when he's saying, sometimes you need to wait a second to set the hook. So there's no definitives in fishing. All of those in every scenario that I just outlined are a possibility. They can nail this thing while you're cranking it in on the super heavy rod. They can engulf it in a third of a second and you set the hook immediately, and they can blow a jet of water out and you have to wait a second to set the hook. So it's not an exact science. Fishing is tough and it's fun to figure all this crap out and play around with all of it. But at the end of the day, it is great to try all these different methods because they all work in different scenarios for different reasons. So did I enjoy fishing like this? Absolutely. It was so much fun. I'm going to be doing it again because I really do want to see how big of a bass I can catch. And I've also been doing a lot of research by reading a ton of really, really boring books most people consider them boring. I love them, about bass migrations, where they go in certain times of the year, all this stuff. I really want to try and catch a good sized bass. So I recommend, if you haven't ever tried this out, go get yourself a medium heavy, pretty stiff rod, some crankbaits, and some heavy mono. Let it rip. You might catch the biggest bass of your life. You might catch nothing. So thanks. I hope you learned something from this episode. If you did, hit the like button, share it with your friends. I don't know, whatever people do on the internet. So thanks for listening. I will be back soon with another episode. Hey, thanks for listening to the Aptitude Outdoors podcast. If you're getting anything out of this, if you're learning something, if it's helped you in any way, go down in the link below and buy me a coffee. Throw me $1, throw me $2. We greatly appreciate it. Just using it to keep this ship afloat. So thank you very much.